How can you ensure that your faith in God stays intact when the prayers for something you want so desperately are not being answered? This is another pain-filled question, isn't it?
Let me just release you from something. Your faith doesn't have to be perfectly intact. It doesn't. One of my favorite stories in Mark chapter 9, there's this boy who has an unclean spirit, and this father of the son is desperate. And so he brings the son to the disciples, and they are asked to do an exorcism. And you know what the disciples do? They mess it up. They can't do the exorcism. And so Jesus shows up on the scene, and everybody's kind of in a tizzy. And finally, Jesus strikes up a conversation with this man. And he asks this man, hey, how long has this been going on? This is Mark chapter 9, verse 21. And the man says, from childhood, it's cast him into the fire, into water to destroy him. Can you imagine having a little boy who is like going into fire and water because he's possessed and sick and can't control himself? But the man continues, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And then Jesus says, if you can, all things are possible for the one who believes. And then one of my favorite statements, the man responds, I believe, help my unbelief. Okay. How much faith do you need to have? Does it need to be perfect? Does it need to be free of doubt? Nope. You can have plenty of unbelief. You can have plenty of pain. Here's how much faith, just enough faith to go to Jesus, to ask one more time. You know, Job, when he didn't get his questions answered, we talked about him a few weeks ago. If you read all of his statements in the book of Job, there are these long soliloquies where he's almost like talking to himself. His faith is shaken. It's not an intact faith, but it's faith. One of the blessings of faith is that just like everything else, it doesn't have to be perfect in order for God to love us.
There's a passage in John chapter 6 that's really very important to me. And it's a passage that came to light when God said no to a prayer that I prayed over and over and over again. It seemed so obvious that he should say yes, and he didn't answer the way I wanted him to. And I was really frustrated with God. I was angry with God. And I came across this passage that's kind of fascinating. In John chapter 6, Jesus is, in the latter half of the chapter, he's having this very, very poignant, hard question. And he's talking to this crowd of Jewish people who think they've got all the answers, and he's going right after them. And what he's saying is hard for them to hear. And it says that some of the crowd dispersed, and even some of the disciples left. And as Jesus is watching all of this happen, he says to the disciples, well, what about you? You know, the 12, what about you guys? Are you going to leave too? And Peter says something that's really interesting because he betrays the fact he doesn't like what Jesus has been saying. He doesn't like the answers Jesus is giving. He says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And the way I understand what he's saying there is, yeah, we'd like to go. We don't like what you're saying. It's not what we want to hear. It's frustrating, and we'd like to wander off like everybody else. But if we wander off, where else can we possibly go? Because you are the only one who has the words of eternal life. Dear friends, we need to realize Jesus isn't afraid of our questions. He's not afraid of our doubts. He's not afraid of our anger or our frustration. What he desperately wants to avoid is us in those moments walking away. We can be angry with God. We can be frustrated with God. We can have questions and even doubts. But the key is that we cling to faith. And as Zach said so beautifully, that we have just enough to go to Jesus in those moments.